Good evening. We are so excited to welcome you all again to another iteration of Why Should I Vote, which is a Bible study series we have going on here at Wiley University. Wiley University seeks to develop the mind, the body, and spirit. And our community gathers in various ways throughout the year to share in spiritual practices and observances. 41 million members of Generation Z will be eligible to vote in the upcoming election. And Wiley, which is an institution that's affiliated with the United Methodist Church and the Julius S. Scott Senior Chapel, are imparting rather to students the importance of voting, especially from a biblical perspective. And so this evening, we are proud to present our third iteration of Why Should I Vote? This evening, we'll be hearing from the perspective because of the historic and social impact by the Reverend Winford K. Rice Jr., the senior pastor of the Beulah Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. Reverend Rice is a 2014 Phi Beta Kappa magna cum laude graduate of Morehouse College, where he received his Bachelor of Arts degree in Religion and Philosophy and was a top-ranking scholar in the Department of Religion. While at college, Dr. Rice served as the president of the Martin Luther King Jr. International Chapel Assistance Program, presidential ambassador, NAACP Political Action Co-Chair, and UPS scholar. We are so excited that Dr. Rice is here with us this evening. We will offer a prayer and hear from Dr. Rice. Let us bow our heads and consecrate our minds and hearts. Oh God, we thank you once again for this day, for the opportunity to be in this sacred and even virtual space. We thank you for the words of Dr. Rice and what he will offer to us this evening. We ask, oh God, that as we hear from him, that we would receive, dear God, that which you have imparted in him. And we ask, God, that we would leave changed, better informed, and most importantly, with a desire to do what you've called us to do. Bless now what our eyes will see, our ears will hear, and most of all, what our hearts will feel. It's in your name that we pray. Amen. I'm excited to bring Dr. Rice on. Dr. Rice, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. And to all of our friends viewing tonight on Wiley University, we greet you from Atlanta, Georgia. We are glad to be here this evening.
Glad to have you, my brother. We're in your hands and looking forward to a great night.
Thank you so much. And Wiley, would you all help me to celebrate you all's amazing Dean, Dr. Duffy, for the incredible convening of scholar practitioners in the fields of religion and theology and politics and more. I'm grateful to share space and platforms with my sister and brother, the Reverend Dr. Stephanie Joy Griggs, and also my dear Morehouse brother, from another mother, the Reverend Dr. Willie Dwayne Francois III. I'm grateful to share space with both of them and to Dr. Duffy for an important conversation tonight. I want us to begin by thinking about the moment that we are in. I want us to think about the moment that we are in as we prepare tonight for a Bible study series. I also want to invite you all to join me in the Old Testament and a very familiar passage of scripture in the book of Micah. In the book of Micah, there's a very familiar passage of scripture, and I'm reading tonight from the New International Version of the Lord's Writ, Micah chapter number 6, verse 8. There's a striking interrogative that is lifted up for our consideration that will help to frame our time together as we think about the historical importance and the social impact of voting, specifically for people who are Black and brown. Listen to the words of the minor prophet from the 8th century Micah. God has told you, O mortal, what is good and what does the Lord require of you? But to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Thank you for taking a moment to read that text with us tonight. If you have your mobile apparatus or whatever the case may be, if you have a hard copy of your Bible, I invite you to keep this scripture open because we will be working our way through the text tonight as we think about what it means, again, for us to be in the time period that we are in, uniquely situated in the historical continuum of Black and brown people in America who have fought laboriously for the right to vote. In the text tonight, the prophet Micah asked the question, what does God require of us? And the answer is simple. He says to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. One of the first questions of this text that we must press the prophet Micah with is, what do you mean when you say act justly? There are different iterations of justice. There are various understandings of how we ought to seek justice. For example, there is a difference between retributive justice and restorative justice. Retributive and restorative justice are not the same. Retributive justice in many ways focuses on assigning the consequences to an individuals who have committed a crime that is commensurate or equal to the crime that they have committed. But restorative justice does not look to pay an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but rather restorative justice focuses on repairing the harm that is done or the injury that has been done by the perpetrator and asking the question, why did this individual feel the need to violate another person or place or thing in the way that they did? Instead of us locking someone up or throwing someone away in terms of ontological degradation of personhood, right? In terms of us discarding of people, restorative justice asks the question, what can we do to not only restore this person, but what can we do to have larger conversations and discourses in the public sphere that help us to ask the question, why did this person act in this way anyway? Why did this person feel as though they could violate somebody else in our society? And so tonight, as we think about the text, I want us to wrestle with the question, what did the prophet Micah mean when he asked and said, what does God require of you? And the first thing Micah says is to act justly. What is justice? Our dear friend and fellow philosopher, Dr. Cornel West, argues that justice is what love looks like in public. Again, Dr. Cornel West says that justice is what love looks like in public. And again, I want us to continue to press and lean into our moral imaginations and ask, what is justice and what does it look like in the public sphere? Well, Dr. West says that justice is what love looks like in the public sphere. And then we have to ask the question and really wrestle with this notion of love. What does it mean for us to love an individual? What does it mean for us to love not only on an individual level, but also on an institutional level? We have to ask the question that was percolating throughout the pandemic, and that is, what is the most loving thing to do? This is a question that is rooted in Kantian ethics from the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who asked the question, what is the most loving thing that we ought to do? When we are talking about seeking justice or acting justly, we must ask ourselves, what is the most loving thing for us to do? And how might we carry out what is the most loving thing to do in the public for the most amount of people who will benefit from what we believe is just? When we talk about justice tonight, we are not talking about just us working to ameliorate or eviscerate certain social systems. No, but we are working to reconfigure what the public sphere normalizes. We are working to reimagine what society looks like when we talk about justice. Justice is not as simple as retributive justice. You made a violation and therefore you must now pay the consequences. Or in the words of the old colloquialism or cliche, you did the crime, therefore you must do the time. I want us to reimagine and rethink the ways that we fundamentally conceptualize of justice. Dr. West says justice is what love looks like in public. And if we accept this definition prima facie, that means on its face value, then we must be willing to take justice from the confines of the academy as a theoretical or hypothetical idea, and we must give it flesh and bones. We must enflesh justice in our rhetoric and think about the ways that we talk about people. For example, the felon versus the prosecutor. Justice helps us to reimagine in the public sphere the way that we use language. In the words of Toni Morrison, right? We must be attentive to the ways in which we do language. And so when we say that justice is what love looks like in the public sphere, what we are inviting you into is an opportunity to reimagine and rethink and recreate what the public sphere looks like. It's an opportunity for us to upend existing systems of power. It's an opportunity for those who are male-bodied to divest from their male privilege in the public sphere so that other individuals may have equitable access to goods and upward mobility and what Dr. West calls social ontology. Right? When we talk about justice in the public sphere, we're not just talking about something that is, again, theoretical or hypothetical. We are talking about enfleshing love, figuring out what is the most loving thing to do for the most amount of people that is beneficial, to the degree that we can reshape public discourse and we can recreate public space, right? And so as we think about this tonight, and the notion of justice in the public, I want us to think about where we are uniquely situated in 2024. 60 years ago, there was an individual by the name of John Lewis who marched and braved with a host of other individuals, some of whom are known and some of whom are unknown, who braved the logics of white supremacy and said that we are going to redefine what love looks like in public. Tonight, we have a unique opportunity, just days away from a historic election, to reflect on the uniqueness of the place we find ourselves in history. Just 60 years ago, friends, African Americans in this country did not have the right to vote. For some of us, our parents were born in the 60s. For some of us, our grandparents, who may still be alive or who may now be with the ancestors, were looking for upward mobility and access to domestic goods that would have given them a better way of living. The 60s was not that far away. It's not that far gone. And so tonight I want us to hold on to the fact that we are still uniquely situated, just a few generations removed from generations and eons of individuals who did not have the right to vote, who were fighting not only for the right to vote, but were fighting for a human right to live and to be and to thrive ontologically in an anti-Black world known as America. Framing the moment historically requires us to go further than the Voting Rights Act and the braving of the Edmund Pettus Bridge by a host of individuals who came from an admixture of organizations, from the SCLC, from SNCC, and from all over the country, taking freedom rides, which is also another anniversary that we celebrate this year, the 60th commemoration of those freedom rides from the north to the south of individuals who braved, again, the tenets and the logic of white supremacy. But before then, we have to go back another 100 years to the ending of the Civil War by President Abraham Lincoln, who signed into effect the Emancipation Proclamation, which then created a slippery slope or a snowball effect of various events that were impactful to the history of not just Black America, but America writ large. Let's begin after the Civil War. Let's turn a few pages back in the history book and situate this moment uniquely in history and in time, to the degree now that we have an African American woman running for the presidency of the United States of America, who just so happens to be a graduate of the world-renowned and illustrious Howard University. Let's talk through the Civil War amendments. After the conclusion of the Civil War and the freeing of slaves in America, or those Africans who were enslaved, you have the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th amendments of the American Constitution that are ratified from 1865 to 1870, also known in history as a period of Reconstruction, which some African American scholars refer to this as a period of deconstruction because of the ways in which deconstruction or Reconstruction systematically sought to depreciate the quality of life for those who are Black and brown in America. The 13th Amendment was the abolishment of slavery. The 14th Amendment had to do with giving due process and equal rights to individuals under the law. But the 15th Amendment that came along between 65 and 70 had to deal with the right to vote for Africans in America. Why is this important, and why does this matter to the conversation and discourse tonight? Because as the amendments were being ratified in the period of 1865 and 1870, in a real sense, the public sphere was being reconfigured and recreated and reimagined. We've talked about justice is the fact that love is expressing itself in public. And during this time period, though it was forced and it was not voluntary. We saw throughout history a period of time where the American Constitution was ratified and recreated to be more inclusive, and I do that with air quotes, of individuals who had just gained their freedom. Because in the words of Kelly Brown Douglas in her seminal book, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God, the word free black is an inherent contradiction. It is an oxymoron and an irony of proportions to the degree that we have to ask the question, what did it mean to be free and what did it mean to be black? These were ideals that were seemingly antithetical and oppositional to one another. To be free and to be black meant in many ways that a person who was of African descent did not possess freedom. And so Kelly Brown Douglas helps us to understand that as the Civil War amendments were being instituted in the American Constitution and ratified in a very subtle way, the American social imaginary was beginning to recreate itself. It is what the CNN political pundit Van Jones called white backlash. It is this idea that every time there's progress in America, there's always backlash by the dominant culture, right? And we saw this, the freeing of those enslaved individuals. And then there was Reconstruction, which brought about a multi see through the period as we move Reconstruction period, we find what is called the nadir. The nadir is really important because this is one of the periods of American history that is considered to be one of the lowest points in American history, where Africans were not only considered to be ontological others, they were considered to be ontological degenerates. Not only did they not have civil rights, in many regards, they did not have human rights after being emancipated from the institution of chattel slavery and the antebellum South. And so we fast forward 1860-65, a 100-year period, and we find ourselves again uniquely situated in an opportunity where there are a number of social movements that are converging on the South in Georgia and in Mississippi and in Tennessee and in various places of Alabama that is uniquely creating a melting pot of activists who are looking to, again, recreate and reimagine and rethink the public sphere for those persons who have been kissed by the queen of the solar system. And in 1965, we finally see, and I only have John Lewis's picture because he is known and remembered for leading the melange of people who crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge tonight. And though we know there were others who were unnamed, we know that there were plenty of women who were unnamed. We know that there were plenty of individuals who may have identified as queer who were unnamed. And tonight, we want to honor the unnamed individuals in this moment who helped to usher in a social renaissance, who may have never marched, who may have never been at a microphone or a bullhorn, who may have fried chicken, who may have packed lunches for those who were marching, who may have passed out water on the routes along the march. We want to honor the unnamed persons tonight. Honor all people who have an opportunity to serve, but their names were never known. And so with that framing tonight, we think about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the subsequent gutting of sections 4 and 5 that were gutted by the Supreme Court. In a 5-4 ruling in earlier years, we saw an upending or an overturning, and a number of major groups, including ACLU, were irate about this overturning because it protected the states that it protected the states that had historically discriminated against minority citizens. This was in many ways the pulse of the Voting Rights Act, to protect individuals and counties and institutions, specifically African-American minority citizens who lived in spaces and places where they were seeking to recreate the public sphere and were prohibited from doing so. Sections 4 and 5 helped to give protections to them, and it upended previous Supreme Court precedents. And somehow or another, whenever there's progress, there's always backlash. When we saw the ratification to the Constitution and the freeing of slaves, we saw Reconstruction that was also known as the deconstruction of Black America, though the Reconstruction of America, there was backlash. And when we see the development of the Ku Klux Klan, that is backlash to the oxymoronic language that Kelly Brown Douglas uses, which is a free Black. There is progress and there's backlash. And we see it again in 1965. There's progress with the Voting Rights Act. And only years later do we find America reinventing itself again in the public sphere, and there's backlash. We saw it in the 2008 election after George Bush with Barack Obama, who served with great integrity and class and excellence for 8 years. And then we saw white backlash again with Donald Trump. And so as we think about the moment of progress and backlash tonight, I want to introduce us or situate us ideologically where we are within the confines of a white Christian nationalism that has masqueraded and presented itself as an endemic understanding of Americanness. White Christian nationalism. That is to say that there has been throughout American history a conflation of racial and religious identities in America. And what it has meant to be white and what it has meant to be Christian is unequivocally what it has meant to be American. Can I say it one more time? What it has meant to be white and what it has meant to be Christian is also what it has meant to be American. There is, in the development of American religious history, a conflation of racial and religious identities. So when I say what it means to be white and what it means to be American is also what it means to be white and what it means to be Christian is also what it means to be American, is because it is difficult to disentangle racial and religious identities and machinations from each other in and throughout American religious history. This is critical. This is critical for us framing the moment tonight. And to help us to understand the critical nature of this, we look to the language and the rhetoric of James Baldwin. When he writes Letter from a Region in My Mind in 1962, he says, "For the horrors of the American Negro's life, there has been almost no language. There has been almost no language to describe the atrocity of the American project and the ways that it has exacted its power and hubris and hegemony upon the bodies of American Negroes." When we look throughout the course of history, and we look from 1865 to 1965 to where we are uniquely situated approaching 2025, the rhetoric and the locutions of James Baldwin still hold true. For the horrors of the American Negro's life, there is no language to describe the ways in which Blackness has been assaulted and attacked. And so I say all of that to say, as we approach the conversation of voting tonight, we must take into account the history that uniquely find ourselves situated in. And as we think about the horrors that have impressed themselves upon African Americans and the vast amount of issues that we currently from and racial justice and public discourse and education to the continued hyper-policing of Black bodies and the problematic institution of mass incarceration, to seeking cannabis justice, the decriminalization of marijuana in all 50 states that negatively affects Black and brown people disproportionately, continual and the perennial attempts to suppress the Black and brown people and minorities writ large across America, to continue police brutality and reimagining public safety, to, again, making sure that all people are included in the inalienable rights that this country proffers to offer all people, to continued fights for reproductive justice and reproductive rights for women. There are a host of issues that continue to press upon minorities and people in America. And we must take into account the fact that for some people, more is at stake than others. What do you mean? When we think about the fact that in many ways, yes, for African Americans, there have been horrors of which we do not have language to describe, we must think specifically about the rhetoric, not only of James Baldwin, but of Black women, as we uniquely find ourselves with our first both Black woman and Asian American as well, introducing us again to the conversation of intersectionality. The intersecting identities of Kamala Harris is something that cannot be overlooked in this election cycle. And why is that important? Because historically, white women could vote, but Black women could not. And again, when we think about the various waves of feminist movements, first, second, and third waves, specifically the first wave of feminism did not advocate and lobby for the rights and the equality of Black women. It advocated for the rights and the equity of white women to have the same social status or the apology as, but Black women were not included in this. And Kimberly Crenshaw talks about this in her critical work in critical race theory on mapping the margins, as she talks about political and structural intersectionality. What do these words mean? I'm so glad you asked. When Dr. Crenshaw talks about political intersectionality, she talks about it from the vantage point of addressing how both feminist and anti-racist politics have marginalized issues of violence against women of color. That is to say that Kimberly Crenshaw helps us to think about not so much the representational aspects of structural intersectionality, but the political implications of what it means to be Black and also what it means to be a woman, and the way that this impacts our social location and our positionality in society. When we talk about political intersectionality, what Kimberly Crenshaw is helping us to understand is that both feminist policies and anti-racist policies and politics in many regards did not include Black women. Anti-racist policies were primarily interpreted by Black men for Black men. Feminist policies were primarily developed by white women for white women in tandem with white men, which left Black women on the margins of society. It left on the margins of the public sphere, and it left them on the margins of the discourse. And so in attempts to reimagine in the public discourse and in the social imaginary the ways that we could brilliantly bring into the conversation all of these intersecting identities, Kimberly Crenshaw helps us to think through the political dynamic, but also the structural dynamic. She says structural intersectionality examines the ways race and gender compound identity politics for women of color more so than for non-Black women or for primarily white women. In other words, she's asking the question, if we are showing up at the polls, we are showing up at the polls understanding that we are voting not just for the first woman, but we are voting for potentially the first Black woman, and not just the first Black woman, but the first Black and Asian American woman as well. There is nuance to tonight's conversation, historically and socially. And I want us to honor that nuance contemporarily. Contemporarily is left blank on purpose because I want you all tonight to fill in the blank, to fill in the blank. How does intersectionality affect the vote in your life? How does intersectionality affect the vote in your neighborhood, in your county, in your state? Who are the people who we need to bring into the conversation to rethink what justice looks like in public? I want us to honor that nuance tonight. And as we honor that nuance, again, I appreciate the historical importance of the election that is coming up. When we think about the nuance of the narrative of African Americans and the role that Black religiosity has played with social impact and progress, we have to have a conversation about Black church. Because W.E.B. Du Bois says in his seminal text, The Soul of Black Folks, that the Negro church of today, written in the early portions of the 20th century, he says the Negro church of today is the center of Negro life in the United States. Thus, one can see in the Negro church today, reproduced in microcosm, all the great world from which the Negro was cut off by color prejudice and social condition. He talks about the Black church in chapter number 10, entitled Of the Faith of Our Fathers. And as W.E.B. Du Bois talks about this work of the ways that the Negro church was at the epicenter of not only American society, but Black America, the church of American epicenter of Black society, because it is a microcosm of dominant culture writ large. He helps us to understand that some of the issues of color prejudice and social conditioning have withheld African Americans from achieving some of the same feats of our great countrymen and women. And he says that the Negro church, or the Black church, has been one of the greatest institutions. Yes, it has done great harm. And I want to pause and acknowledge that tonight. Yes, the Black church has done, and as an institution, the Black church has done significant things for America and for society. So I want to offer that nuance and that caveat tonight. But W.E.B. Du Bois is helping us to understand that the Black church is in some ways a radical institution that has been a place of spiritual safety and succor for African Americans in an anti-Black world, or to use the language of Sean Copeland, in a Negrophobic society. And the Black church has also safeguarded us from the logics and the entrapments of white supremacy in some ways. And so tonight, W.E.B. Du Bois helps us to remember that you can't have a conversation about the historical importance and the social impact of voting without having a conversation about Black religion, and specifically the Black church. Because it is through the Black church that the civil rights movement is birthed. It is through Black church and Black religiosity, because we also understand that there are significant contributions from the Nation of Islam and other Black religious traditions as well that help to develop the civil rights movement and other movements for Black lives. But we must honor tonight Black religions, and specifically the Black church, as an institution. So as we frame tonight's conversation of Micah asking the question, what and Yahweh, or God, being that to act justly and to love mercy and to walk with our God. And now we find ourselves in the text for tonight. Having walked through some of the historical and social interlocutors, now we address the text. In Micah chapter number 6, verse 8, the question is asked, God has told you, O mortal, what is good? And what does the Lord require of you, my friends at Wiley? What does God require of you, my friends here in Atlanta, or anyone who may be watching tonight? What does God require of us? What does Yahweh require of us? Very simply, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. I hear you tonight. Who is Micah, and why are we taking his word out of all the words that we could be listening to tonight? Here's an understanding of the prophet Micah. The prophet Micah is considered to be a minor prophet. He is an 8th century prophet who lived amongst the contemporaries of Isaiah and Amos and Hosea, somewhere between the times of 740 and 700 BCE. Why does any of this matter? Because it's important for us to understand who his contemporaries were to get a better understanding of the content. We have to understand context to understand content. He is along the prophets of Hosea and Amos and Isaiah, who are also in their own way calling for justice. The Old Testament prophets here are responsible for speaking truth to power, and with specificity and nuance, they offer logical approaches, and they deconstruct the practices that are happening in their time, and they are calling out the injustices as they are happening real time. That's what prophecy is about. It is not about you standing in a money line and somebody telling you something you already know about yourself. And that's not throwing shade. It's just the biblical understanding of prophecy in some ways is different than what social media would have us to believe prophecy is. Micah is a prophet. And Micah is rebuking the religious and professional individuals who offer deceptive comfort and don't prophesy unwelcoming truths about Jerusalem, akin to this idea of American exceptionalism in some ways, that this country is so great that it can do no wrong. He is standing in direct opposition of religious leaders who are co-opting their religiosity for the sake of making a profit. They are co-opting tradition and their calling. They are perverting their calling so that they can remain comfortable in their positions. My God. And Micah speaks out against the aristocracy of Judah and predicts that the northern kingdom will eventually fall to Assyria. When you have a moment, I invite you to read backwards in the book of Micah to get the entire picture painted again. I want you to have context so you understand the content. There are grave injustices taking place in this political and geographical and biblical dispensation. What exactly is taking place? Micah is condemning the rich and wealthy individuals who stole the property of impoverished farmers that supported the privileged class. Well, who is a part of the privileged class? The princes, the judges, the priests, and dare we say the false prophets. One more time, who's a part of the privileged class? The princes, the judges, the prophets. And Micah responds to this by not going along to get along, but going against the grain to the degree that he was willing to upset the institution enough to speak in a way that affirmed his call and that also agitated the status quo, right? He affirms his call, even though it's not popular. He still engages in the discourse and tells the people, let my people go, right? He still tells Pharaoh, let my people go, euphemistically speaking. But then he also is strong enough and bold enough in his call to not only speak truth to power, but to go against the grain and to reimagine what love looks like in public. And he has a problem with the ways in which property has been stolen from impoverished farmers because he understands that this affects their livelihood. And he asked the question, as we should ask tonight, what is the most loving thing to do? And what does God really require of us? I'm so glad you asked. God requires of us three things very simply, and I promise I'll be out of your way. God requires of us to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. It's that simple. When Micah says do justice, it literally means that we ought to act in ways that are just. It literally means that we have, this is a $50 word with a 5-cent meaning. We have a deontological responsibility unto God and unto ourselves to act in such a way that is loving. That's what it means to do justice. It means for us to act in such a way that is loving. And when we ask ourselves, what is the most loving thing to do? We must think about the people who exist on the margins and the periphery of society. If we like the language of the old Baptist preacher said the least of these, those who are those who are lost, who have been left out, and those who are not loved. We must be thinking about the least of these. We must think about individuals who exist on the margins. We must think about people who don't fit within categories that are black and white, but they exist in the gray. We must think about individuals who may not be able-bodied. We must think about people who may not practice in the same way that we practice, and they color outside of the lines. We must ask the question, what is the most loving thing for us to do for the most amount of people that is beneficial? If you've ever been to a Black Lives Matter rally or a rally that affirms Black lives, you may hear the chant, "It is our duty to fight for freedom. It is our duty to love and to win." We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. You've heard this once, you've heard it twice from Asada. Shakur, that is a deontological ethic. When we say it is our duty to fight for freedom, it is our duty to get up and go vote. We are saying that that is rooted in a deontological ethic. That means that it is a duty unto ourselves and it is a duty unto God. When we use our vote, we are using our voice, and that's what God requires us to do. We must use our voice for the voiceless. We must use our influence for those who do not have the capacity to articulate their own challenges and their own problems and their own predicaments. And if we are not careful, we will mistake their silence for their complicity. And so we must do justice. But not only must we do justice, but we must love mercy. The Hebrew language for mercy is transliterated as kindness. We must love people kindly. And friends, that is not deontological, that is theological. Do you possess a theology of love? Does love inform everything you say and do? And does love inform your vote? Dr. King writes in his seminal text, Strength to Love, when I talk about love, I am not talking about some weak and sentimental feeling. But Dr. King says in Strength to Love, when I talk about love, I am talking about a great ethic that all of the world's religious traditions adhere to and abide by, because love is a transformative power that helps us to become transformed nonconformists. In other words, what Dr. King is saying, when we root ourselves in an ethic of love, we show up in the world in such a way that we have a theological orientation that asks the question, what is the most loving thing for us to do that benefits the most amount of people? And by that, we must adhere to. So we have from the prophet Micah something that is deontological, something that is theological. Our theology ought to be rooted in love. And my question is, why does loving people require so much hate? Why do we have such hate and disdain for one another across the aisle of Republican and Democrat? How do we embody love when it comes to voting? And then we are to walk humbly with God. That's praxeological. When we think about the praxis of our religious convictions, there are various Pew's research databases that help us to see that we may think of love and justice in the public sphere a little differently, and that's okay. On the right side, you see red. That represents those Republicans who are religious and they are supporting Donald Trump. On the left, you see blue. That is for religious individuals who are supporting Kamala Harris. And tonight we can see that our nation is divided on what we believe love looks like in public. White evangelicals don't look and believe the same as Black Protestants of what justice and love look like in public. When it comes to comprehensive gun reform, we may not see eye to eye, but we must ask the question, what is the most loving thing to do to protect our children? When it comes to women's rights and reproductive health, we must ask ourselves, what is the most loving thing to do? Is it for individuals who are male-bodied to be making policies about individuals who are female-bodied or who identify as women? What is the most loving thing to do? To let people have autonomy over their own bodies. But as you all can see, some of us do not agree who are siblings in Christ because we don't have the same theologies of God. And friends, tonight, what I'm asking us to do is to rethink what love looks like in public. And how do we do that? By thinking about the various reasons why we ought to vote. Because number one, your vote is resistance. Your existence is resistance. Your voice is your vote. And therefore, your vote is resisting the hegemonic domination of the empire. What do you mean when you say that? Your vote is an opportunity to resist the not only entrapments of evil, but the ways that it shows up in the world every day. Your vote is resisting systems that seek to take us back. that seek to make America great again. Your vote is resistance to the empire of America that, again, literally seeks to prey on Black bodies. Your vote is resistance from individuals who not only want to take America back, but want to take some of us back as well. Your vote is not only resistance, your vote is righteous. There are individuals who did not necessarily die for you to have the right to vote. They died, and as a consequence of their dying, we have a sacred responsibility to vote, because our vote is rooted in resistance and our vote is rooted in righteous indignation. We ought to be indignant about what we see happening in the world. To the least of these, we ought to be indignant about some policies that we see being enacted in America by the Supreme Court. We ought to be indignant and therefore understand that our vote is rooted in our righteous indignation. Our vote is a way of talking about righteousness as it rolls down and justice as it comes down like a mighty stream. Your vote is not only resistant and righteous, but your vote is relevant. How Dr. Raphael Warnock said at the Democratic National Convention that our vote is a kind of prayer about the world that we want to live in. And so when I say your vote is relevant, your vote is not only your voice, but it's a prayer of sorts. It's a prayer for the world that we want to create together. It's a vote, it's a prayer, it's relevant because it helps us to rethink what the public sphere looks like. You may be asking how, because as we know right now, there are issues in America with diversity, equity, and inclusion, as we see some predominantly white institutions have repealed, or the Supreme Court has repealed, affirmative action that negatively and disproportionately affects the admissions process and the retention rates as well of African Americans and other minorities at predominantly white institutions. Oh, your vote is relevant because you have an opportunity to be able to put a president in office who also has an opportunity perhaps to place somebody else on the Supreme Court, because some of the justices that are on the Supreme Court now were put on by the former president, and they are a conservative majority that is negatively now affecting people who look like you and I. When we think about women's reproductive health and rights and the overturning of the 1973 Supreme Court case of Roe v. Wade, friends, your voice and your vote is still relevant. When we think about the ways we can close the racial wealth gap in America for minority citizens through canceling student loan debt, and we continue to see the Supreme Court and other courts go back and forth on whether or not this is morally permissible or not, on whether or not this is legal or not, friends, your vote and your voice, it still matters. When we continue to see voter suppression and purging, specifically in states that have been targeted before, friends, our vote still matters. And we encourage you tonight to get involved. Get involved with any and every organization that you all can. Faith United to Save Democracy, the Black Church PAC, Political Action Committee, Fair Fight here in Georgia, ACLU, which represents the American Civil Liberties Unit, NAACP, whatever the case may be, wherever you are, we need your voice and we need your vote. And this, friends, is what God requires of us: to love, do mercy, and to walk humbly with God.
Dr. Rice, incredible. Thank you so much for giving us what has motivated you, what has given you the impetus to go out and fight this fight, and more importantly, from the religious aspect, your faith that drives you to this civic engagement has just been incredible to hear. I want to ask you a couple of questions, and I didn't mention this earlier, so please forgive me. And all due respect, we're hearing this evening from Dr. Rice, who is a Harvard trained seminarian, who is currently at Emory University, well equipped, as we mentioned earlier, graduate of Morehouse College. The aspect that has struck me the most in the past couple of days is this conversation with President Barack Obama and his um, conversation with black men this
Yeah.
weekend in relation to their responsibility to vote. And we're two black men. And what's come to mind is I know that you just shared with me backstage that you were getting ready to celebrate your 10th anniversary at Morehouse of graduating. And Barack Obama spoke while you were there as a junior in 2013 during commencement. And he received
Hmm.
a lot of feedback, both positive and negative, on sort of the rhetoric that's quite similar to the rhetoric we've heard this weekend. So, my question to you is, in this conversation of Micah, of an individual who was coming out to share hard truths, do you think that President Obama is in that lockstep of a prophet and sort of sharing hard truth with black men particularly? Or do you think that some of his comments were unwarranted? And how do we place that in the conversation with young black men, as you're a professor at Morehouse, as you're working as a pastor with young black men? How should we take those comments from our former president?
Yeah, so I mean, he's certainly made an uproar and made some waves on social media this weekend with the comments that he made about black men voting and the importance therein. And again, I think as we frame the conversation rooted in tonight's text of Micah 6, thinking about our deontological responsibility, we have a duty to
Mm,
vote, and
yeah.
that duty is in acting in the best interest not only for ourselves but for those who we share community with as well. And as we share community with other individuals, we have a responsibility to, again, show up in the world in ways that not only benefit ourselves, but to benefit the brothers who are with us as well. Obama was in the White House, I believe, and had an initiative, I Got My Brothers Back, right?
Yeah.
Um, and a part of that initiative was ensuring that we do not leave behind black men in society that is not only negrophobic, as we talked about, that in many ways also seeks to, I think, disparage not necessarily the black male ego, but seeks to disparage black men as a project of this kind of American social imagination, right? That in America, a unique opportunity to send a sister to the White House, right? And if we are going to have an honest conversation, we've got to talk about the ways that patriarchy still
Mm,
exists, right? On a kind of microscopic level and on a macro level as well, right? And we have to think about the fact that misogynoir exists as well, right? Not just misogyny, but misogynoir, which is a specific disdain towards black women. And black men have an opportunity to support a black woman, not just any black woman, a black woman from Howard University who's a
yeah.
member of Alpha Kappa, Alpha sorority. We have a responsibility not to just have each other's backs, but to have our sisters' backs, because guess what? Black women have been having the brothers' backs for a long time. And as we even talk about black church tonight, there is no black church if there are no black women and no sisters, right? We heard from Jacqueline Grant and Kelly Brown Douglas and a number of other women and scholars who help us to understand the nuance of black church in that regard. I can go on and on, but I think that's what I gather from Obama's comments this weekend. We have a unique opportunity to return, if you will, the favor. That's some of the language of some of the older folks, to return the favor, because guess what? Black women showed up for Obama.
Mhm.
And so now it's time for black men to show up for a black woman as well.
That's powerful. That's extremely powerful. The last question that comes to mind based on your talk this evening is surrounding the nadir period of American race relations. This is, of course, post slavery. We're in Reconstruction, what you've offered as deconstruction, which is a powerful statement. What relation do you think we have in that deconstruction period to 2024? And what should our responsibility be in ensuring that we still exist post what happens after November 5th?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I immediately think about Dr. Emily Towns, her book, Woman's Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil, where she says that evil always reinvents itself.
Yeah.
And that's what I was talking about with Van Jones' comments, the political pundit from CNN, who said that after any period of racial progress in American history, there's always backlash. And that is another way of saying that evil literally reinvents itself, right? And so as we think about reshaping the public sphere, or thinking about what justice looks like in public, and so reconfiguring what the public sphere of the social imagination looks like, I think, yes, we still find ourselves in an nadir. And I think that we fool ourselves if we think that we live in a post-racial world, because
Mm,
if Donald Trump has shown us anything, is that white supremacy and racism and the entrapments therein are still very much alive and existing in the superstructure of American society. They exist on a material level. When we continue to see Black and brown people hyper policed and filmed, and Black death is consumed in a way that is pornographic, we are still in an nadir. When we literally had to stop in 2020 for the deaths of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, and there were people in American society who argued that scientific racism does not exist, we are very much still in the nadir. And by scientific racism, a discrimination on the basis of race and physical features, right? Bona fide Blackness. You're not passing the paper bag test, right? We are still very much in a nadir in that regard. Even when we look at infant mortality rates and of Black babies and Black mothers, right? Again, the systematic death of Blackness and Black people, very much so, we are still in a nadir. And I think that that's part of the conversation about evil reinventing itself. It always creatively finds ways to reinvent itself. There's no longer the KKK, there's Jim Crow. And then when there's no longer Jim Crow, there's Jane Crow, and Jim Crow 2.0, which is mass incarceration, right? It reinvents itself constantly. And so we fool ourselves if we truly believe that that we have gained this freedom. And
yeah.
so how do we exist in the world after November the 5th? The same God who was with us
Mm,
in 2016
my Lord.
is going to be the same God who's with us in 2024 going forward, whatever the outcome of the election is, right? And I know that sounds superfluous in some regards, but it's Bible study. And I truly believe the same God that sustained us and brought us through the Reed Sea and allowed Pharaoh to drown before has the same capacity to do it again.
Friends, we have heard an incredible word and information overload from Dr. Rice this evening that will go down, I think, as one of our most impactful conversations. I'm going to put Dr. Rice backstage for just a moment as we just do a moment of conclusion and closure. But we are again incredibly blessed to have heard from him this evening and all of the insights that he's offered. But we have two other conversations that we want you to be part of. Again, we're asking the question, why should I vote? We've heard from Dr. Stephanie Joy Griggs, who told us because of the psychological importance. Last week, Dr. Willie Francois, because of its political sacrament. This evening, because of the historic and social impact by Dr. Rice. Next week, we'll hear from the Reverend Doctors Andrew Wilkes and Gabby Wilkes, who will share because distributive justice should be ours. And we'll conclude on the 31st of October with the Reverend Hazel Cherry, who will answer the question, because I love my neighbor. We ask this evening that you all would go in peace, that the peace of God would go with you. We look forward to seeing you all next week and look forward to all that we have going on at Wiley University. Have a good evening, everyone.